right, we are ready for an overview of Deuteronomy. Hopefully everybody picked up an outline. Does anybody need one? Anybody need an outline? Okay. We need a couple outlines over here. Danny, are you handling that? Danny Bush? All right, keep your hands up and Danny will get you the material. The book of Deuteronomy. Got a couple up here, or at least one. Thank you, guys. All right, the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to finish the Pentateuch today, looking at these overviews. The book gets its name from its contents, and it's actually a Greek name, combination of two, Deuteros, which means second, and Nomos, law, Deuteronomy. So this book is a recap of all the events from the time they left Mount Sinai after having received the law. And so chapter 1, somebody wants to, well, I'll tell you what, I'll start the reading off, and somebody else can read after me. Deuteronomy chapter 1, beginning in verse 5. On this side Jordan, in the land of Moab, began Moses to declare this law, saying, The Lord our God spake unto us in Horeb, saying, Ye have dwelt long enough in this mount. Turn you and take your journey, and go to the mount of the Amorites, and unto all the places nigh thereunto, in the plain, in the hills, in the vale, and in the south, and by the seaside, in the land of the Canaanites, and unto Lebanon, unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Behold, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give unto them and to their seed after them. So, you know, some of these books cover a very short period of time, some longer periods of time. And this one here, well, I have time, and what I mean by that is when these events were taking place. Chapter 1 and verse 3, it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month. So this is post-Exodus, 40 years, 11 months later. They have wandered through the wilderness, and they are just about to begin the process of conquering the land. And that's what the book of books of Joshua and Judges are all about. One of the things that impresses me is this next point here. The book repeatedly appeals to the love of God and His constant provision for Israel. So go ahead and be turning over to chapter 8. But, you know, as we've been doing these overviews, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers so far, we've noticed in each book that there's just constant complaining. And you know, in the book of Exodus, it was 2 months out of captivity, all right? And the way I look at this, it kind of amazes me. I guess it's easy for us to sit here on a padded seat with air conditioning to say, well, I would never complain like that. Well, easier said than done, but it wasn't 2 months after they came out of 400 years of captivity and Israel starts complaining. And so, repeatedly throughout Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, complaint after complaint after complaint. But the book of Deuteronomy, in spite of that, the book of Deuteronomy repeatedly appeals to the love of God and how He constantly provided for the children of Israel. So I have chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. So somebody read that. I was going to pick one or two, but let's read the whole thing, somebody.
Every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe. You may live and multiply, and go and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers. You shall remember the Lord God with you, all when you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and test you, to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments. So He humbled you, allowed you to know that He gave you a man which you did not know, when your father had, that He might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone. Man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Your garments do not wear out, when you keep swell these 40 years. You should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you.
And so I guess particularly there, verse 4, 40 years, your garments did not wear out, nor did your foot swell. And that's obviously an intervention on God's behalf, if you want to use that word. I can't keep a pair of tennis shoes 6 months. I need another one. 40 years. And in pretty rough territory. But that's just, I'll give you two examples here, but there are multiple examples of God's love and provision throughout the wanderings, but also in spite of all of the complaining that they did. And again, one of their complaints we see repeatedly. And of course, I would say the very first one was, so they've escaped Egypt, they get to the Red Sea, and here come the Egyptians, and why'd you bring us out here to die? I mean, that's their first complaint, really, before they even get out of the realm of danger. But God provided for them even then, didn't He? Separated between them and the Egyptians, split the Red Sea, and allowed the people to cross. So that's one thing that we see throughout the book of Deuteronomy. Another thing is there are repeated statements of Israel's stubbornness, so we'll just look at a couple of those. Chapter 9, verse 6, understand therefore that the Lord thy God giveth thee not this good land to possess it for thy righteousness, for thou art a stiff-necked people. Verse 13, furthermore, the Lord spake unto me, saying, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. And that word reappears time and time again, but then my mind goes to the New Testament, to Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is preaching in Jerusalem to the Jewish people, and he preaches about all their history, and that included the time of the Exodus and the going into the Promised Land and all of this. And as he's concluding that sermon in Acts chapter 7, I think it's verse 51, he says something along the lines of, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, you do always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so did you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? Well, then to show who they really were, they killed him. And so this is part of Israel's history. Constant rebellion and stubbornness and sin. Chapter 10 and verse 16, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart and be no more stiff-necked. There is constant emphasis on carefully observing all that the law required. So I want to consider this one for just a little bit. Let's go to the chapter 28 passage. Deuteronomy 28. This is what we call the chapter of blessing and cursing. So there's this idea that nobody could keep the law. I know you guys have heard that. I've heard that. It was impossible to keep the law. That's a lie. That's not true. Because throughout the revelation of the law to Israel, God says, be careful to observe all that I command you. Now, if God says, be careful to observe all that I command you, yet they were incapable of observing all that God commanded them, what does that say about God? He's requiring the impossible. So somebody read Deuteronomy 28, 13 and 14. Okay. Verse 14, look at I'll put the emphasis there. And thou shalt not go aside from any of the words. What does that mean? That means don't fail to do anything that I require you to do. It means it's doable. It has to be. Because again, what kind of a God would it be that would require your strict obedience and warn you of punishment if you don't, and then say, do it? I mean, that's not just. That's not a just God. Yes. Yeah. I've kept all those commandments from my youth. The rich young ruler that turned away from Jesus sorrowful. Now, here's the thing. Jesus didn't question the fact that he said, I have kept all the law from my youth. So the problem was not him keeping the law. The problem was his heart. Because you need to go and sell all you have and give to the poor and then come and follow me. And he turned away sorrowful because can't do that. So that shows me something too about keeping God's commandments, that you can keep all of God's commandments and still lose your soul. And we see that throughout the Pentateuch. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, and all thy strength. And of course, Jesus reiterated that. He said, this is the first and great commandment. Well, that's stated throughout the Pentateuch to us, to Israel, recorded for us. And within that same context, it would say, and keep the words of this law, something like that. So the love of God, in other words, it's possible to keep the law without loving God. What we might refer to, the way I've heard it referred to before, is kind of like checking the boxes. You know, going to church. Well, we did the 5 acts of worship, and I'm a good person through the week. And there's a detachment of the heart. It's kind of like Jesus says in Matthew 15, this people draws near to me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. The two have got to be, what's the word? They got to be done together, and they can be done together. You can observe everything that God requires of you, and you can love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength as you're doing that. But there are a lot of people who will tell you, oh, nobody could keep that law. Well, then God was unjust because He told them to. And He told them to keep, not like what Brother Simers just read there. Look at it again, Deuteronomy 28:14. Do not turn aside from any of the words which I command you. That's not hard for me to understand. And so, that leads to the next point. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 30. It was possible for Israel to do not only what God commanded, but exactly what God commanded. All right? So look at Deuteronomy 30, beginning in verse 11. For this commandment which I command thee this day, it is not hidden from thee, neither is it far off. In other words, it's not impossible to do. And by the way, this is quoted in Romans chapter 10 and applied to the new covenant. All right? It is not hidden from thee, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that thou shouldest say, who shall go up to us to heaven and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? Well, God came to the mountain, didn't He? And gave it to them. They didn't have to go find God and figure this all out. Neither is it beyond the sea that thou shouldest say, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it unto us that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very nigh unto thee, in thy mouth and in thy heart, that thou mayest what? Do it. It's not impossible. You don't have to do some great, wonderful feat to accomplish God's will. You just have to do it. Now we know, of course, having the whole historical account, and then, of course, having the New Testament, like Hebrews chapter 8, for instance, verse 13. Nope, Hebrews chapter 8, it was before that. I think it's verse 7. God found fault with them. That's why He put away the first, that He may establish the second. The fault was not with the law, because the law could be kept and the law came from God. And that's Paul's argument in Romans chapter 7. You look at Romans chapter 7 and verse 12, he says the law is good and the commandment is holy and just and good. Well, the reason is because God's the one who gave it. There's nothing wrong with the law. God found fault with Israel because they didn't keep the law. But He told them to keep it, and it wasn't too hard for them to keep. It wasn't hidden or in some far-off land somewhere where they had to do the impossible to do it. You just do it. And it's amazing. I've told you this a lot before. I prepare lessons for class and stuff like that, but I do my own reading too, just for myself. And it's amazing the reading I've done over the years by preachers in the Lord's church who proclaim that nobody could keep the law. That's just not true. I think, well, I'll tell you what. Somebody turn over to Luke chapter 1 and read verses 5 and 6. Let's just look at one example. Luke chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, please.
There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judah, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of
Abiah.
And his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God,
Listen to this.
walking in all the commandments.
How many of them? How many of them? Walking in a few of them because they couldn't keep the rest of them? They were blameless. Walking in all the commandments of the Lord blamelessly. And so I think what some people do, I'm pretty sure I know what people do. The argument is, well, we all sin. Well, yeah. That's obvious. But that doesn't mean you can't keep the law. Either the law, as speaking of Zacharias and Elizabeth there, the law of Moses, walking in all the commandments of the Lord blameless, or now, even more so, the law of Christ. And we've talked about that, particularly going through Leviticus. You think about all of the physical, just like the dietary laws and the sanitation laws and bodily discharge laws. Everything was revealed precisely what they were to do. And they walked in all the commandments of the Lord blameless. We're not required to do that, to do what the law required. We're under law to Christ, but we don't have all those particulars, dietary laws and restrictions and all that kind of stuff. So don't tell me we can't keep the law and keep it blamelessly. What were you going to say? Yeah. Mr. Doyle mentions Noah. Okay, and that wasn't even the law of Moses, was it? That was the patriarchal time. And I want you to build this ark that's 450 feet long and 75 feet wide and 50 feet tall. And I want you to do it like this. And he did it. You cannot tell me that you cannot keep the law just as God requires. Somebody on the live stream says, wonder where Nadab's and Abihu's heart was when God punished them. Well, Nadab and Abihu is an interesting case. Of course, that's Leviticus chapter 10. And the more I've studied that, so you have that account in the first 7 or 8 verses, and then verses 9 and 10, it goes straight into, don't drink wine because your judgment will be affected. And I've started connecting those two thoughts. I don't know, I may be off, but the first thing that's impacted by the consumption of alcohol is your judgment. Well, I'd find it kind of interesting that you have that account where they offered something that was not, which the Lord had not commanded them, and then it goes straight into don't do this, so that way you can tell the difference between the holy and the unholy, the clean and the unclean. I don't think that's there just by accident. Any questions or comments by anybody? All right. There are repeated expressions of God's love for Israel, past, present, and future. The first few chapters go a lot to the past. But then throughout the book, you see too, like in connection with the land promise. You're going into the land, you're going to possess it, which I swear to give unto your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then the present, for 40 years you've wandered and your clothes didn't wear out, your shoes didn't wear out, your feet didn't swell. And then future, I'm giving you the land. Go and take it. I will fight your battles for you. So that's repeated throughout these 34 chapters. The 10 Commandments. Let's go to chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4. And if somebody would please, read 13 and 14. Deuteronomy 4, 13 and 14. Okay, so they're referred to specifically as the 10 Commandments. And, that was not, the 10 Commandments, they were not the totality of the law. The way I've kind of expressed it before is it's kind of a lays out an umbrella for every other commandment. The count is, and particularly here in Deuteronomy, 613 commandments. And I forget how many positive and how many negative. But they're all encapsulated under, every one of those is under one of those 10 commandments. The first 4 have to do with man's relationship to God, and the last 6 have to do with man's relationship to man. You cannot find one commandment of the 613, or however many, that is not connected to one of those 10. And so that's why they're called that. And it's repeated a few times here, not only in Deuteronomy, but through the rest of the Pentateuch, that they were written with the finger of God. So I think that's Exodus 31 and verse 18. And they were on 2 tablets of stone. Well, then you get to the New Testament and you read passages like 2 Corinthians chapter 3, which talk about the 10 Commandments and calls it the law of Moses and calls it the Old Covenant as contrasted with the New Testament. And then you get to Ephesians 2 and Colossians 2, where that old law was, those commandments contained in ordinances were nailed to the cross and taken out of the way. Because, frankly, a lot of people do believe that we're still under the 10 Commandments today, yet the New Testament itself says that was nailed to the cross. Paul, for instance, in Romans chapter 7 and verse 4 says, "You have died to the law that you might be married to him who was raised from the dead." We are not under the 10 Commandments today. They were taken out of the way. And we live under the law to Christ. And that's the thing. And it's like James, James mentions it in the negative sense, but Paul says in Galatians 5, if you're going to keep part of the law, you're a debtor to do what? The whole law. You can't pick and choose. And there in Galatians 5, specifically, he was talking about circumcision. If you're going to do the whole thing, you're a debtor to do the whole thing, but then if you're going to do that, you've fallen from grace. What James does in James chapter 2 is he goes from the perspective of if you keep all the law and you offend in one point, you're guilty of all. So it shows that you have to keep the law, the whole law. It's also called the law of Moses. I threw this in here. These are not in the book of Deuteronomy, but these 10 commandments are also called the law of Moses and the law of God. So there's this idea that some people have, and I actually ran into it the other day, and I forget where. It's like somebody wrote me an email or something asking a question. I don't remember. But there are some people who try to differentiate. They say, well, there's the ceremonial law, okay, like all the dietary laws and the laws of like leprosy and the kind of the day-to-day minutia, you might say. So you have the ceremonial law, but then you have the 10 Commandments. So we're not under the ceremony, but we're under the rest of it. It's all the same thing. It's the 10 Commandments, it's the law of Moses, it's the law of God. The Bible never, when talking about these laws, it never differentiates between a ceremonial being in force or going away as opposed to, let's say, a moral or civil law that's in force or gone away. It's all the same thing. And so we have to understand that. We have another comment here on the stream. It says, "Good morning from Derek and Tammy in Ponderay, Idaho." That's Derek and Tammy. Derek's one of our elders, of course, for you visitors. But glad you guys are on here and hope you have a safe trip. The law was inscribed on tablets of stone. We're here in chapter 4. Did we already read verse 13? Seems like somebody did. Yeah, the Ten Commandments. And he wrote them upon 2 tablets of stone. And then it's mentioned in a couple other places. And then finally, let's go back to chapter 30 here. Deuteronomy lays out the way of life and the way of death. And it's a choice. Deuteronomy 30. Somebody read 15 and 16, please.
See, I have set before thee this day life and good, and death and evil. And that I command thee for this day to love the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments. Though thou mayest live and multiply, and the Lord thy God shall bless thee in the land whither thou goest to possess it.
Okay, verse 15 is so key here. I have set before you, how does he say it? Life and good, and death and evil. It's before you. In other words, you have the choice to make here. And, that's the way God has always treated man. It's amazing that so many people believe that you can't choose, that, your sinful nature, you can't choose unless God specifically elects you. And if He specifically elected you, He's going to send His Holy Spirit to you, and the Holy Spirit's going to give you a new heart. Then you can choose to do good. But it's not really a choice, because God has not only chosen you, but He sent His Spirit to change you. That's no choice. That's called force. It's amazing if you really understand how many religious groups believe that idea of sinful nature and God has to change you. You can't change yourself. God says, no, I've set before you life and good, death and evil. And so we'll cover this in Joshua too. Joshua 24:15. Choose you this day whom you will serve. Which God are you going to serve? Well, you have to choose that. Any questions or comments before we stop? All right. Appreciate your attention.